M.O.V.E podcast number 2, The Luxury of Options. Hey everyone, this is Tony Cashman the Insightful here. In this episode of the podcast, which by the way, the acronym actually spells out mysterious, omniscient, versatile, and essential. So that's a little tidbit for you. But in this episode, we're going to go over why I think my insight and responsibility dynamics and dilemmas otherwise, they have given me a really good ideal perspective that I would have never exchanged for anything else in the world, even as lost as I was the whole time. You can check the previous episode for that, the first one of this series, how I've been lost in the unknown by discovering things in it. But yeah, this time we'll just go over a bit about how I feel about the idea that even if my insight was going to give me things that I didn't have to have, but they were still going to be blessings and brilliances in their own stead, that I actually managed to learn responsibility in a way that didn't have to be done a certain way, didn't have to be the only way, or even too many different ways, if you get catch my drift. So, I don't think of it as being this, I'm at a loss for words right now, but, oh, by the way, if the audio is bad, I'm sorry, I'm not recording my headset right now. I could, but I'm not going to do it right now, so. Just bear with the power director at mobile audio on my phone, my iPhone 6s. But, so, I think people sell me too short. I say this a lot, but people sell me too short when they think that I have too many different ways of doing something, or not even that specific description, but when they think of me as someone who doesn't see the big picture because of being in the nitty details. That's word for word, verbatim, how I've heard it sometimes from family and friends. But it's something of its own beast when I hear that I didn't do something right, whenever I think of it as being the best way to do something versus the right way to do something. Because right implies two options, and that best implies more than three, I guess you could say. Because three is not so much of a crowd, I guess. Well, let's say two is company, three is a crowd, but three or more being more what literally few would mean, it's a couple. But that's the ideal logic of that. But, so, if I had to be descriptive or even give an example, I tend to be someone who does have a luxury of options, and I don't throw shade on people who are like, well, Tony, don't you want to actually do the right thing for once, or do something that actually would maybe be popular choice, or go against unpopular opinion, or not have to only be about popular choice or unpopular opinion, but actually doing something that actually makes sense for everybody to do if it's already been done, and not have to polarize that too much with a yin-yang perspective. I don't believe in karma entry, by the way. I mentioned in the last video. But, I had a lot of different ways to do things in my life. I didn't have to throw shade on that too much, but it just, I think I just got lucky sometimes when I grew up my lifestyle, like my own life story, the way I define a lot of things. When I define myself as being a candidate, this kind of a campaigner to try to become the most important person of all time, as I mentioned in previous videos on YouTube, that journey was not in vain too much. I don't think of it as being a failsafe where I don't have to know any better, but even that ambition, let alone trying to be inescapable or have a rally point inside culture thing, etc. Not trying to force too much of anything, especially if I'm not pressuring myself to do things. But speaking too much fast for that, I do think that there were times when I didn't have a luxury of options, and I don't think it was only because I had too many options at first. But you can certainly look at my life story, as I said earlier, where I did have this dreamy state of living, and still gloomy in other ways, edgy and gloomy, but dreamy and brilliant in other ways, where you don't have to think of it as being, I didn't have any better choice. That's how I usually felt about philosophy. I didn't have to know what I was doing with philosophy, because if it was a passion, I'm pretty sure at some point it would be, if it isn't already. But especially as unique as my philosophies have been, however abstract I can describe certain things, especially these podcast episodes, it tends to be that the philosophy I do is brilliant whether I'm passionate about it or not, or even doing it for free of will, or determined that big philosophy discussion itself. But, or ethics or morals or spirituality, etc. But I don't think that I cheated per se. Insight gives me a way to do things differently that I think makes a lot of people impressed with me. And I think when I was seen as a charismatic person, the semantic person, the very well-intentioned, doing everything for a reason kind of person that everyone loves and admires sometimes, if even most of the time, or all the time, depending on the person. But they seem as being brave, for one thing, some of my friends at least, thank gosh. But I never saw myself as a cheater per se, and I have some controversial philosophies and insights about how you can lie, cheat, and steal without it being wrong. I can get to that on the episode on YouTube, but it's not in vain. I didn't cheat, if in the essential sense. I did not cheat with my insight or my luxury of options. I didn't have to do something wrong on purpose just to know the right thing. And sometimes I felt like that before. I definitely described that in my own terms before, but what we can get into in this episode is about how I feel about inside responsibility, because I described that a lot in the 2018s, or year of that therein. I described how I felt like my tragedy was loosely connected, if not very much connected, to the idea of being irresponsible but very insightful, and that could be a contrast from people who are responsible not insightful. That's a cliche of it, flip side of it, but because 2018, of course, I was schizophrenic. I think you've seen some of my content before in the OG version of my channel, on Cosmo days. Even when I was doing claimations, I was still somewhat whack. But I don't know if I was clear on the claimations, but the starting ones at least. Which is kind of sad, thinking that's how the first official launch of my claimations had happened. But I think of it, and I can try to slow down my speech over time if I can. But there is truth to how I do things, and I did have good intentions with the cultist magic stuff, spirituality, all of that stuff. Not even so much religion or spirituality, but spirituality more so than religion, I guess you could say. That's how it's been described by some YouTubers. There was truth to my cultist magic journey. I didn't have to describe too much in the meme posts, but when I did do those videos, I was trying to find answers to things that didn't have to be woo-woo all the time. And so when I had luxury options in that regard, yes, I could have done the right thing and just sacrificed my well-being, or not my well-being, but like my good intentions or dreams, even, as I've seen many times in the past before in my life story. Sacrifice the good intentions and see if it means better to do what people think I should be doing, even if they're still going to be wrong. And that's when the luxury options could have its own truth. Because when the luxury options includes the right thing, you obviously think that the right thing has to be done, and even with the luxury, which means that the luxury wouldn't have to be good at all. But I can think of it, I think an insight I did come to that seems cliche and responsible-esque, is that when you have any alternative to what you think is the best thing can be the best thing. Because for you to know that there's an alternative to what you're doing with your decisions, if it can be entertained at all, being a better alternative or even as a sacrifice ordained that way, and I'm sorry for using big words, but they no longer last as a main choice or even as a ideal choice. It's like, think of it like this: you don't tell someone to eat the chocolate ice cream, and this is a good example actually. I'm just making it out of blue, but to eat the chocolate ice cream when they know the vanilla ice cream will be diabetic and vegan for them, whatever, diabetic and not as allergenic, and they think to themselves, well, this is the ideal choice, but the alternative is actually better for me. That means that the ideal choice is not an ideal. I'll even get into a future episode about this later, where I had so many actual and ideal selves, versions of myself, but really, any actual self of yourself that is ideal is not an actual self. If you are someone who happens to know that, and I'll get to the main topic in a second, but again, bring this back in circle. When you're someone who has so many actual ideal selves that you don't know how to recognize them, you really just have one or two, ideally speaking. That would be not for like a parallelism of not knowing the difference of actual and ideal, which hopefully can happen if it's supposed to be possible or guaranteed. Guaranteed not. But you can only really essentially have one actual ideal self, because the actual self is whatever is the least ideal, and the ideal self exists outside of the realm of being actual. And I know that makes sense to some of you guys already, because for me, I did have the idea that even the actual self that I was thinking of was still somewhat ideal, because it was projected in a sense that I didn't already exist in a certain reality of that. A certain reality I didn't already have. And that has to be ideal. And that the opposite then to that is what I just said earlier, which is that actual selves that are ideal are no longer actual. There's an ideal extension that cannot be quantified. They're just all in the ideal realm. Or maybe they're just all in one kind of thing. That could be spiritual, but So to have a luxury of options, it's not because I sound scatterbrained right now anyways, but I know what I'm doing with this podcast. I know what I'm doing with my thoughts. I organize them over time. I don't have to be Jordan Green about this, but I think of it being that if I was just going to do the right thing every single time without fault, even if I was still going to be wrong, ironically, that's how controversial and complicated I want a perfect life to be. I do that with a good intention, and I do that with very beautiful insight. But insight isn't everything, as well as even responsibility not being everything. Responsibility is still very important. Insight is still very beautiful. But to have no sense of what you should limit yourself with in your options, and this is why I'll get into why I'm pro-materialistic in a future episode, but because the reasoning with I have materialism is that materialism can still be good because you have a way to compare and contrast things with different colors and insights, and minimalism can still be good, but that's my insight with it, is that it doesn't have to only be good. And I mean even bigger insight, which is that not all bad things are good, not all good things are bad. Controversies, I guess you could say, or even conspiracies. Get into my future episodes on March for whatever other controversial things I happen to be doing. But so yeah, the luxury of options. Just keep in mind that if you have more than 3 or more than 2 ways to do something, you're not in the wrong. You just have a way of orienting yourself and organizing your pathways. Maybe you open more doors because of the disciplines you put in the meantime anyways, regardless of whether the responsibility meant you should have only had picked one option or the other, or if you really did know what you were doing, like me. And that's not even a brag, but like if you actually knew what you were doing, but you didn't hold it against yourself because of that brilliance that you have, to know that even if you have more options, it doesn't necessarily mean discovering the right thing, or even discovering what the best thing would be. Because that's my biggest gamble with the best and the right thing, is that the best thing is an ideal. The right thing is a promise. Thank you guys very much for this episode, and I'll see you in the next video. Talk to you, catch you in the Insightful, everyone. Bye.